The scrape of a chair leg against hardwood didn't just vibrate through the wall, it felt like it scraped directly against the base of my spine. I live my life by a strict set of accruals and deferrals, everything in its right period, everything balanced to the zero. Silence is my most valued asset. But tonight, the equity of my quiet apartment was being liquidated by the new tenant in 3B. I stood in the center of my living room, listening to the muffled thud of boxes, unaware that the variable on the other side of that plaster wasn't a stranger. It was Emery. And the moment the moving truck's engine faded, the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise, charged with a proximity I wasn't prepared to audit. For the last 5 years, my routine has been a masterpiece of reconciliation. I come home, I hang my coat on the hook that never moves, and I spend my evenings auditing the day's chaos into neat, manageable rows. I'm an accountant, not just by trade, but by temperament. I like clear margins. I like knowing that if column A and column B don't match, there is a specific, solvable error to find. Living alone in a single occupancy unit was the ultimate control environment. No unexpected liabilities, no shared equity. Just me, the hum of the refrigerator, and the predictable silence of a Tuesday night. Then came the invasion. It started with the heavy, dull thud of cardboard hitting the floor, followed by the agonizing screech of furniture being dragged across vinyl that had clearly seen better days. My walls, usually a sturdy barrier against the world, suddenly felt like paper. I tried to focus on the spreadsheet open on my laptop, a complex risk assessment for a mid-sized manufacturing client, but the cadence of the move-in next door was impossible to ignore. It was erratic, urgent. Every dropped item felt like a discrepancy I couldn't adjust away. The rhythmic banging against the shared wall shook the picture frames on my side, tilting my carefully aligned diploma just a fraction of an inch. I stared at it, irrationally annoyed, waiting for the silence to return so I could get my heart rate back to its baseline. Then it happened. A laugh. It pierced through the drywall as clearly as if she were standing in my kitchen. It wasn't a polite, neighborly chuckle. It was a full-bodied, cascading sound that dipped low at the end. My fingers froze over the number pad. I knew that laugh. I had that laugh cataloged in a file I hadn't opened in over a decade. It belonged to summer nights and scraped knees, to secrets whispered under blanket forts, to a time before billable hours became the metric of my existence. It belonged to Emery. The air in my apartment suddenly felt too thin, sucked out by the vacuum of that memory. I moved to the door, my socks sliding silently on the floorboards, and pressed my eye to the peephole. The optical glass distorted the hallway into a fisheye tunnel of fluorescent yellow. I saw movement, flashes of denim, the corner of a brown box, the blur of a hand gesturing, but I couldn't see a face. My breath caught. The statistical probability of her moving into the unit adjacent to mine was infinitesimal. We were supposed to be parallel lines now, running on similar tracks but never intersecting. I leaned my forehead against the cool metal of the door, closing my eyes. 15 years ago, we were inseparable. We were a merger of equals, sharing everything from lunch money to anxieties about the future. We had a language that didn't require words, just glances and proximity. But time is the ultimate depreciating factor. We drifted. Careers took precedence. I went into audit. She went. I didn't actually know where she went. I just knew that the space she left behind had been written off as a loss long ago. The friendship had dissolved, not with a massive blowout, but with the slow, agonizing erosion of unanswered texts and holiday cards that eventually stopped coming. Another thud from the hallway, followed by a muffled curse. Damn it! The voice was deeper now, sharper, authoritative, but the timbre was unmistakable. It pulled at something in my chest, a tension that felt dangerously like hope mixed with dread. I couldn't just stand there. An unaccounted variable is an auditor's worst nightmare. You can't close the books if you don't know what's driving the variance. I needed to verify the data. I needed to see if the ghost on the other side of the wall was real. My hand hovered over the deadbolt, the metal cold under my palm. Opening this door meant acknowledging that the past was no longer a sunk cost. It was a current liability, standing right there in the hallway. I took a breath, steeled my nerves, and turned the lock. The fluorescent hum of the hallway lights hit me first, a stark, buzzing yellow that washed out the world. And there, standing amidst a fortress of cardboard boxes labeled Office and Archives, was the anomaly. Emery. But not the Emery of my memory. Not the girl with grass-stained jeans and tangled hair. This Emery was sharp angles and high-contrast tailoring. She was wrestling with a heavy crate, her back to me. But the line of her shoulders in that charcoal blazer was unmistakable. It was a structured garment, professional, designed to command a boardroom, yet here she was, sweating slightly in a dim apartment corridor. Emery. The name felt heavy on my tongue, a forgotten password suddenly remembered. She froze. The crate lowered slowly to the carpet. When she turned, the air in the hallway seemed to compress. It was a physical impact, like the sudden drop of an elevator. Her eyes, dark, intelligent, and currently wide with surprise, locked onto mine. For a second, the 15-year gap collapsed. I wasn't a senior auditor. I was just the girl who used to trade sandwiches with her. But then, her gaze sharpened, the professional veneer sliding back into place like a shutter. "Well," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. It was the same disarming curve I remembered, but now it was paired with a dangerous level of confidence. I ran the numbers on a lot of variables for this move, but I definitely didn't factor you into the equation. I leaned against my doorframe, suddenly conscious of my oversized sweater and the lack of a blazer. "The statistical probability is significant," I managed. "I thought you were in Chicago. Or was it New York?" "Chicago," she corrected, brushing dust off her sleeve. "But the firm needed someone to lead the new merger here. Transfer pricing and risk, you know how it is." "I'm in audit," I said, the words tumbling out. "Internal controls." She laughed, a softer sound than the one that had pierced my wall, but it still vibrated in my chest. "Of course you are. You always did like checking everyone else's math." She stepped closer, navigating around a stack of books. The scent of her hit me then, not the old smell of rain and cheap body spray, but something complex. Expensive paper, cedar, and a faint, sharp citrus. It was the scent of success, of late nights in high-rise offices, of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth on the open market. We stood there, in the awkward, charged neutral zone of the hallway. Two accountants, two childhood friends, two strangers wearing the skins of people who used to love each other. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled with the static of things we weren't saying. I looked at her hands. No ring, just a sleek, silver watch that probably cost more than my first car. She caught me looking, and for a moment, the professional mask slipped. Her eyes softened, tracing my face with an intensity that felt less like a casual glance and more like a forensic audit. She was scanning for changes, for damages, for retained earnings. "It's good to see you," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "I mean that. It's unexpected." "It is," I agreed, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "I'm right here, 3A, if you need sugar or a spreadsheet template." She smirked, turning back to her door, keys jingling in her hand. The metal scraped against the lock, a harsh sound in the quiet. She pushed her door open, revealing the empty, dark space of her new apartment, a mirror image of mine. She paused on the threshold, hand on the knob, and looked back at me. The fluorescent light caught the sharp angle of her jaw. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. Then her expression shifted, becoming playful, knowing, and terrifyingly intimate. She nodded toward the wall that separated our living rooms. "And just a heads up, neighbor. Be careful what you say in there. The walls are thin. I can hear everything." The words hung in the air, loaded with implication. She didn't wait for a response. She stepped inside, and the door clicked shut with a definitive finality. I stood there for a moment, staring at the wood grain, my pulse roaring in my ears like a distorted bass line. I backed into my own apartment and closed the door, leaning back against it, my breath coming in short, shallow hitches. The silence that settled wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, vibrating, alive with the sudden, terrifying proximity of her. I looked at the shared wall. It wasn't just plaster and studs anymore. It was a membrane, a conductor, a direct line to a past I hadn't budgeted for. And she was right on the other side, listening to the silence just as hard as I was. The first week of coexistence wasn't just living, it was a passive data collection exercise that I hadn't authorized. The wall between 3A and 3B ceased to be a structural element of the building and transformed into a living, breathing membrane. It was no longer about separation. It was about transmission. I became an unwilling, a compulsive auditor of her existence. I learned that Emery's morning started at exactly 6:14 a.m., not 6:15, not 6:10, 6:14. It began with the aggressive mechanical whine of a high-end burr grinder. It was a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the pre-dawn silence, followed by the specific, heavy thunk of a portafilter being knocked against a counter. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, visualizing her kitchen. I knew she was standing there, probably barefoot, hair messy, waiting for the espresso to pull. I could hear the ceramic clink of the mug. It was an intimacy I hadn't asked for, a knowledge of her domestic rituals that felt dangerously domestic itself. Then came the water. The plumbing in this building is old, the pipes singing a high-pitched aria whenever the pressure changes. I heard the shower turn on, the rush of water against fiberglass. It was a white noise that should have been background, but to me, it was a narrative. I found myself timing it. 7 minutes on weekdays. Efficient, corporate. I caught myself holding my breath, imagining the steam fogging up a mirror I couldn't see. The scent of that expensive citrus and cedar soap seeping under the baseboards. It was maddening. I was trying to maintain a professional distance, but the auditory data was corrupting my baseline. The evenings were worse. That's when the footsteps started. Emery didn't just walk, she paced. It was a rhythmic, percussive cadence. Click, click, turn, click, click. Heels on hardwood. She was working late, likely on a call or dissecting a merger strategy. I sat at my own dining table, a stack of tax forms ignored in front of me, tracking her path like a submarine sonar operator. She walked the length of her living room, paused at the window. I could hear the creak of the floorboard there, and then walked back. It was the sound of stress, the sound of a mind that couldn't settle. I wanted to knock. I wanted to tell her that the floorboard by the window needed a nail, or maybe just ask her to sit down so I could focus on my own depreciation schedules. But I didn't. I just listened, my own work forgotten, my pen hovering over a line item I'd read 10 times without comprehending. One night, the pacing stopped and a different sound bled through the plaster. It was faint, a low melodic vibration that I almost missed. Humming. She was humming. I pressed my ear against the cool paint, straining to identify the tune. It wasn't a radio hit. It was our song. Not a romantic song, but the specific, obscure indie track we used to blast in her beat-up Honda Civic when we were 17. Driving nowhere just to feel the wind, the melody bridged the 15-year gap instantly. It stripped away the suits and the degrees and the polished veneers. For a moment, we weren't two CPAs separated by a wall. We were just us, suspended in the same memory. I sat on the floor, back against the plaster, and closed my eyes, letting the melody wash over me. It felt like she was whispering it directly into my ear. This proximity was ruining my efficiency. My billable hours were suffering. I couldn't focus on spreadsheets when the variable next door was so volatile. The wall acted as a filter, stripping away the visual context and leaving only the raw, amplified presence of her. It was a sensory deprivation tank, where the only sense that mattered was sound. I was living with a ghost who made coffee and paced in stilettos. Then on Tuesday, the auditory became visual. I was down at the mailboxes, collecting a stack of bills, when the elevator dinged. Emery stepped out. Seeing her in the flesh after a week of listening to her ghost was jarring. She was wearing a trench coat, rain-dampened hair clinging to her cheek, holding a stack of envelopes. She stopped when she saw me, that same knowing smile playing on her lips. She didn't say hello, she just tilted her head, looking at the letters in my hand. "Late night last night?" she asked, her voice smooth. "I heard you drop a book at 2 a.m. The air between us crackled. The secret intimacy of the wall suddenly dragged out into the harsh, fluorescent lobby light. We codified the evening as a professional sync-up. It was the safe, sanitized label we slapped on the calendar invite. A convenient way to categorize the expense of our time under networking rather than the far more accurate reopening old wounds. We met at a bistro 3 blocks from our building, a place with exposed brick and acoustics that required you to lean in to be heard. It was neutral territory. No shared walls, no muffled footsteps, just the clatter of silverware and the hum of other people's conversations acting as a buffer. But the moment we sat down, the buffer evaporated. Emery looked tailored, dangerous. She had swapped the moving day blazer for a deep navy silk blouse that caught the candlelight, softening the sharp edges of her corporate persona just enough to be disarming. We started with the safe topics, the standard audit procedures, the nightmare of the upcoming fiscal year end. We spoke in the dialect of our trade, GAAP principles, Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, the sheer exhaustion of busy season. It was a shield. If we talked about spreadsheets, we didn't have to talk about the 15-year gap in our balance sheet. We didn't have to discuss why she left or why I stayed. But Emery has a way of weaponizing the mundane. She swirled her wine, the dark liquid coating the glass, and looked at me over the rim. "You know, in mergers," she said, her voice dropping that octave again, cutting through the restaurant noise, "the biggest risk isn't the financials, it's the culture fit. You can have perfect numbers, but if the entities don't mesh, the whole thing collapses." I took a sip of water, my throat suddenly dry. "That's why I stick to internal controls," I countered, keeping my voice steady. "I like predictable outcomes. I like knowing that the assets equal the liabilities plus equity. It's clean." "Clean is boring," she murmured. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, closing the physical distance between us. "You have to leverage a little risk to get a return, right? Otherwise, you're just stagnating. You're just maintaining a zero balance." The double entendre hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't talking about tax codes. She was looking right at me, her eyes dark and unreadable, challenging my carefully curated safety and solitude. I watched her hands as she spoke. They were capable hands, manicured but strong, no jewelry except that silver watch. No ring, no tan line where a ring used to be. She traced the rim of her wine glass with one finger, a slow, deliberate circle that mesmerized me. I found myself tracking the movement, imagining the texture of the glass under her fingertip, feeling a phantom sensation on my own skin. It was irrational. It was unprofessional. It was exactly what I had been trying to avoid. The conversation shifted then, the mask slipping further. She laughed at something I said about a difficult client, but the sound trailed off into a sigh. God, I missed this, she admitted, the arrogance fading into something softer, lonelier. Everyone in my department is so calibrated. We talk about work, then we go home to empty apartments and do more work. It's efficient, but it's hollow. I thought you liked efficient, I said softly. I do, she said, holding my gaze. But even I know you can't depreciate loneliness. It just accumulates. The check came, interrupting the moment. We split it down the middle, two accountants ensuring the ledger was balanced. But as we walked back to the apartment complex, the balance felt off. The air outside was crisp, the city noise muted compared to the restaurant. We walked side by side, our arms brushing occasionally, sending static shocks through my sweater. The physical distance between us shrank with every step. We weren't colleagues networking anymore. We were two people gravitating toward the same center of gravity. We were heading back to the thin walls, back to the intimacy of hearing without seeing. But now, the visual memory of her tracing that glass was burned into my mind. The danger wasn't just in the noise anymore, it was in the heavy, loaded silence that was about to follow. The lock clicked into place, sealing me back inside my solitary unit, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air in my apartment usually felt sterile, controlled, a vacuum where I could exist without external influence. Now it felt stagnant, heavy with the memory of her scent that still clung to my sweater. I tossed my keys into the bowl, the metal clatter sounding aggressively loud in the quiet, and leaned back against the door. My skin still hummed from the accidental brush of her arm against mine on the sidewalk, a tactile ghost I couldn't shake. It was a lingering variable I couldn't reconcile in my nightly audit. I tried to go through my closing procedures, wash face, check email, prep coffee maker, but my attention was entirely focused on the structural partition to my left. It started 20 minutes later. The pacing, this wasn't the confident staccato rhythm of her work heels I'd memorized over the last week. This was softer, heavier, the dull thud of bare feet or socks dragging slightly against the floorboards. It was the sound of insomnia. It was the sound of a mind that wouldn't shut down. Thump, thump, turn, thump, thump, stop. She was walking the same worn path from the kitchen to the window, over and over again. I sat on my couch in the dark, a glass of water sweating in my hand, and just listened. It felt voyeuristic, yet inevitable. I was auditing her stress levels through a layer of drywall and paint, measuring the cadence of her anxiety against my own. My mind began its own internal review, a frantic attempt to balance the books on what was happening between us. In accounting, there's a concept called sunk cost, an expense that has already occurred and cannot be recovered. You're taught to ignore it when making future decisions. The 15 years we spent apart, that was a sunk cost. The friendship we lost, written off. Logically, I should be evaluating this new proximity based only on current data. But emotions aren't GATP compliant. I was terrified that re-engaging with Emery was a high-risk investment with no guarantee of a return. If I let her in, if I let myself lean into this magnetic pull, I risked reopening a ledger I had painfully closed a decade ago. The fear wasn't about the past. It was about the potential liability of a future where she leaves again, leaving me with a deficit I couldn't cover. Then the pacing stopped abruptly. A silence stretched, taut and thin, before a voice cut through the wall. It was muffled, distorted by the insulation, but the tone was unmistakable. Frustration. No, that's not what I said. She was on the phone. My stomach dropped. It was a visceral, irrational reaction. Who was she talking to at midnight? The voice was low, intimate in its anger. I found myself holding my breath, straining to catch the words, hating myself for the intrusion, but unable to pull away. "You're not listening?" she said, her voice rising just enough to carry the vibration through the studs. "I can't keep doing this back and forth. It's exhausting." A wave of jealousy washed over me, hot and sharp. It was a proprietary feeling I had no right to claim. Was there a person attached to that frustration? A partner back in Chicago who hadn't made the cut for the move but was refusing to be liquidated from her life? A he or a she who was currently negotiating for her time? I clenched my hand around the glass, the condensation cold against my palm. I was listening for a ghost, for a variable I hadn't factored in, a significant other. The thought made the dinner we just shared feel like a fraud, a misrepresentation of assets. It's a liability, David. The whole timeline is a liability. David. My heart hammered against my ribs. Then the context registered. Timeline. Liability. She wasn't talking to a lover. She was talking to a colleague. She was arguing about a merger timeline. The relief that flooded my system was embarrassing in its intensity. It was a physical release, my shoulders dropping 3 inches. I wasn't listening to a breakup. I was listening to a work dispute. The realization made me feel foolish, exposing the raw nerve of my own hope. I wasn't just a neighbor. I was a stakeholder, waiting for a payout that might never come. Fine, we'll audit the projection in the morning. Goodbye. The call ended with the definitive sound of a phone being tossed onto a cushion. Silence rushed back in to fill the void, but it felt different now. It felt shared. I couldn't stay on the couch. The distance across the room felt too vast. I moved to the shared wall, the one behind my reading chair, and sat down on the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, leaning my shoulder blade against the cool plaster. I closed my eyes. I could almost feel the residual vibration of her voice in the wall. I wondered if she was doing the same thing, sitting in the wreckage of her frustration, staring at the white paint that separated us. I pressed my palm flat against the surface, splaying my fingers wide as if I could read the braille of her presence through the layers of latex and gypsum. It was just a wall. Wood, drywall, paint, standard construction materials. But in the dark, it felt like the only thing keeping the universe from collapsing in on itself. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, matching my inhale to the silence on the other side, waiting for a sign that the variable next door was still active. Then, in the darkness of my living room, my phone screen lit up. The sudden blue glow was startling against the floorboards. I reached for it, my hand shaking slightly. A text message. One word, from a number I hadn't saved but knew by heart. Awake? The screen glowed blue, illuminating the stagnant air of my living room. Awake. She knew I was awake. 5 minutes ago, the floorboard under my hip had groaned a betrayal. I stared at the cursor blinking on my screen, a rhythmic pulse matching the thudding in my chest. I typed back, hard to sleep when the merger is this loud. I hit send and listened intently. Through the wall, a soft, muffled vibration echoed, her phone buzzing against the floor. She was sitting on the floor too. The realization hit me hard. We were mirrored images, separated by paint and drywall, pressing our spines against the same barrier. Her reply came instantly, "The merger is a mess. The assets aren't cooperating." I smiled in the dark, the light casting long shadows across my legs. Maybe the assets need better management. Or maybe, she typed, the bubbles pulsing as she hesitated, the assets are just scared of the audit. This wasn't about work. We were using our professional language to smuggle contraband emotions. It was a digital confessional. Safer than looking her in the eye, safer than risking the tremor in my voice. Here in the quiet dark, I could be bold. I could type things I wouldn't dare say in the fluorescent glare of the hallway. I can hear you. You know, her next message read. My breath hitched. I stared at the words. Hear what? Everything, she replied. I hear you make coffee at 6:30. I hear you pacing when you're stuck on a spreadsheet. I hear you listening to me. The stagnant air in my apartment suddenly felt very thin. I had treated my observation of her as a one-way mirror, assuming I was the auditor and she was the data, but the audit was mutual. She had been tracking my variances just as closely as I had been tracking hers. The shame of voyeurism was replaced by a thrill running down my spine. She wasn't annoyed. She was paying close attention. I didn't realize the acoustics were so bad, I typed. A weak defense. It's not the acoustics, she wrote back. It's the proximity. We're living in a Venn diagram that overlaps too much. I let my head fall back against the wall, the plaster cool against my scalp. You said the walls were thin. They are, she answered, paper thin, flimsy, like the excuses we used 15 years ago. The honesty of it was disarming. We had built these professional lives, these fortresses of credentials, to protect ourselves from the chaos of feeling. But here we were, two successful women in our 30s, hiding behind a partition that couldn't stop a sigh from passing through. The wall wasn't a barrier, it was a conductor. It was amplifying everything we were trying to suppress. It carried the charge of her frustration, the rhythm of her pacing, the silent weight of her loneliness directly into my space. And I was sending it all right back. We stopped typing. The phone screen went dark, plunging me back into the shadows. But the silence wasn't empty. It was thick, electric. I pressed my hand harder against the wall, imagining her hand on the other side, matching my placement. I could almost feel the heat radiating through the studs. It was a synchronized, heavy pause, a moment where the digital connection was severed, so the physical one could take over. I closed my eyes and listened. I heard the faint rustle of fabric, her shifting position. I heard a sharp intake of breath. She was right there, inches away. The absurdity of it washed over me. We were texting across a distance that could be bridged with a sledgehammer, or more simply, a doorknob. The vibration of her phone buzzed again, a short, sharp sound against the floorboards next door. I looked down. This is inefficient, the text read. The variance analysis isn't working. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. What do you propose? A site visit, she replied. I'm coming over. The text hung there, glowing, terrifying, and inevitable. The wall had served its purpose. It had conducted the heat until the temperature was critical. Now, the safety of the barrier was about to be removed. I didn't type back. I really didn't need to. I just heard the soft scrape of her standing up, the pat of her bare feet moving away from the shared wall, and the distinct, heavy click of her deadbolt turning. I scrambled up from the floor, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and moved quickly toward the door to let the variable in. The knock was barely a whisper against the wood, a tentative, rhythmic tap that contradicted the digital boldness of her text. It was a request for entry that felt less like a neighbor visiting and more like a ghost asking to be let back into the haunt. When I pulled the door open, Emery stood there in the hallway gloom, stripped of her corporate armor. No sharp blazer, no silk blouse, no intimidating heels. Just gray sweatpants and a worn, vintage t-shirt that hung loose off one shoulder, exposing the sharp line of her collarbone. She looked softer, younger, but her eyes held that same relentless, auditing focus. Dark pools reflecting the hallway's fluorescent hum. "It's too quiet over there," she said, her voice rough, scratching against the silence. The silence, it's loud. It echoes. I stepped back, an unspoken invitation. As she crossed the threshold, the atmosphere in my apartment shifted instantly. The air, usually cool and stagnant, a controlled environment for one, suddenly felt pressurized. It was charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. My solitary unit, calibrated strictly for a single occupant, felt impossibly small with her inside it. The wall seemed to contract, pushing us toward the center. She moved to the couch, sitting on the far end, pulling her legs up underneath her in a defensive, self-soothing fold. I took the opposite corner, leaving a precise, calculated distance between us. A buffer zone of beige upholstery that felt like a canyon. But the proximity was overwhelming compared to the safety of the wall. Through the plaster, she was a variable I could manage, a sound I could analyze from a distance. Here, in 3 dimensions, she was a force. I could smell the faint trace of her shampoo, mint, rain, and something warm like sleep, and hear the shallow, uneven intake of her breath. We sat in the dim light of the floor lamp, 2 auditors staring at a ledger we had refused to open for a decade and a half. "We were good at the math," she said quietly, staring at her hands, her fingers twisting a loose thread on the cushion. "Back then. We calculated the risk of staying close, and we decided it was too high. I thought we just drifted," I countered, though the words tasted like ash. "Different colleges, different firms. Life happens." Emery shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement that dismissed my excuse. Drifting is passive. What we did was an active write-off. We looked at what was happening. The way you looked at me during graduation, the way I couldn't sleep unless I texted you goodnight, and we categorized it as a liability. We treated our connection like a material weakness in an internal control system. Something to be identified, isolated, and eliminated to ensure the stability of the operation. The truth of it hung heavy in the room. We hadn't grown apart. We had run away. I was scared, I admitted, the confession feeling like a stone dislodged from my throat. I had a plan, a career path. You were unpredictable. You were a variance I couldn't explain to my parents. I was the only thing that was real, she corrected, her gaze snapping to mine, intense and unflinching. And that terrified you. It terrified me too. So we balanced the books by removing the variable. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with the weight of 15 years of accrued interest. Emery shifted, her foot sliding slightly across the cushion, closing the gap by an inch. "You know," she started, her voice dropping to that low, vibrating register. "When the firm offered me the transfer, they gave me a list of approved housing. Corporate suites, luxury high-rises downtown with concierges and gyms." I looked at her, confusion knitting my brow. This building is historic. It has character, but it's not a corporate suite? No, she agreed. It's not. She paused, tracing the seam of the couch cushion with her thumb. "I ran a search. I didn't pick this apartment because of the hardwood floors. I picked it because I looked up your registration in the state CPA database. The air left my lungs. You knew?" "I knew," she whispered. "I knew you were in 3A. I knew I was taking 3B. I told myself it was just curiosity. A coincidence I engineered, but I think I was just tired of the silence." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't fate. It was intent. She had audited her life, found a deficit, and moved across the country to fix it. The conversation about the past faded, replaced by the undeniable magnetic pull of the present. Our voices dropped to a whisper, a subconscious adjustment to the very reality she had warned me about. The walls were thin. If we could hear the neighbors, they could certainly hear us. It felt conspiratorial, intimate. This sudden need to protect the privacy of a conversation that had already breached every defense I had. The space between us on the couch, which I had calculated as a safe, professional distance, began to feel less like a buffer and more like a void that demanded to be filled. The air in the apartment seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of things we hadn't said for 15 years, pressing in against the windows and the plaster that had separated us only hours ago. Emery moved first. It wasn't a sudden lunge, it was a gravitational shift. She slid closer, the worn fabric of the couch cushions compressing under the change in weight distribution. The movement was slow, deliberate, allowing me every opportunity to retreat, to pull back into the safety of my solitary audit. I didn't move. I stayed rooted, my breath catching in my throat as the physical gap between us evaporated. Suddenly she was right there. The sensory data overwhelmed the logic centers of my brain. Until this moment, she had been a visual memory or an auditory ghost. Now, she was a tactile reality. I inhaled, and the scent of her filled my lungs. Not just the clean corporate cedar I'd smelled in the hallway, but something warmer, deeper. It was the smell of expensive stationery and rain, layered over a base of vanilla that I remembered from 15 years ago. It was the scent of home, updated for a tax bracket we had only dreamed of back then. I closed my eyes for a second, the internal auditor in my head finally putting down the red pen. For a decade, I had been trying to balance the books of my life using incomplete data. I had been treating my solitude as an asset, listing my independence as a form of equity, when in reality, they were just liabilities dressed up in better terminology. I had been cooking the books, filing fraudulent reports to myself that claimed I was happy, that I was whole, that the zero balance at the end of the day was a sign of success rather than emptiness. But the math had never worked. The equations always left a remainder, a nagging variance I couldn't explain away. Sitting here, with the heat of her thigh just inches from mine, the ledger finally made sense. The math of my life only worked when Emery was a variable in the equation. She wasn't a risk to be mitigated. She was the principal investment I had been too cowardly to make. The tension in the room snapped, not with a bang, but with a silent, heavy release of pressure. It was the feeling of a held breath finally being exhaled. The professional logic that had kept us on parallel tracks, the fear of ruining the friendship, the terror of the sunk cost, dissolved under the undeniable physics of the moment. There was no spreadsheet complex enough to calculate the magnetic pull that was dragging my center of gravity toward hers. It was a force of nature, raw and unyielding, defying every risk assessment I had ever written. Then she reached out. Her hand moved across the small patch of cushion that still separated us. It was a slow, searching movement, her fingers grazing the textured fabric before they found my hand resting on my knee. The contact was electric. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal, physiological shock that started at my fingertips and raced up my arm, seizing my chest. After weeks of auditory teasing, of hearing her footsteps, her sighs, her voice through the plaster, the sensation of skin on skin was overwhelming. Her palm was warm, her fingers strong and sure as they wrapped around mine. It was a grounding wire, channeling all the static noise of the last few weeks into a single, clear signal. My hand turned instinctively to meet hers, fingers interlocking, the fit so familiar it made my chest ache. We sat there for a heartbeat, just holding on, the tactile proof of her presence anchoring me to the now. Then, slowly, inevitably, we both shifted, turning our bodies fully toward one another, closing the final distance until there was nothing left to audit. I'm done calculating the risk, I whispered, the admission feeling reckless, like signing a document without reading the fine print. But looking at her, I knew the fine print didn't matter. The professional veneer we had both spent a decade perfecting was peeling away, revealing the raw, unpolished longing underneath. Emery's thumb brushed the back of my hand, a slow, rhythmic caress that dismantled my remaining defenses faster than any logical argument could. "There is no risk," she murmured, her eyes searching mine, dark and dilated in the low light. "Not if the merger is inevitable. We've been circling this valuation for 15 years. The accounting metaphor finally broke, shattering under the weight of the reality in the room. We weren't talking about assets or liabilities anymore. We were talking about the terrifying, wonderful fact that I had loved her since I was 12 and she had moved across the country just to prove she felt the same. She leaned in closer until I could feel the warmth of her breath against my cheek, a physical tether pulling me in. The fluorescent hum of the hallway, the distant traffic of the city, the phantom sounds of the neighbors, it all faded into a white noise. That didn't matter. "You know," she whispered, her lips brushing the shell of my ear, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the drafty windows. "I wasn't joking before. The walls really are thin. There are no secrets left to keep between us. I've heard you pacing for me. You've heard me calling for you. We've been having this conversation through the plaster for weeks. The only difference is that now I don't have to shout to be heard." I turned my head, closing the fraction of an inch that separated us. "Then stop talking," I breathed. The kiss wasn't tentative. It didn't ask for permission. It confirmed a contract that had been signed in invisible ink 15 years ago. It started with a release of pressure, a desperate, hungry collision of mouths that tasted of tea and the lingering sweetness of the wine we'd shared earlier. Emery's hand released mine to cup my jaw, her fingers cool against my flushed skin, holding me steady as the world tilted on its axis. It was the familiarity of the girl who used to braid my hair, transformed into the undeniable passion of the woman who now knew exactly how to touch me. The auditor in my brain shut down completely. There were no columns to balance here, no discrepancies to note. It was just sensation, the softness of her lips, the firmness of her grip, the overwhelming relief of finally being on the same side of the equation. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer until there was no air left between us. The tension that had been coiling in my chest since the moment I heard her laugh through the wall unspooled in a rush of heat. This was the merger. This was the integration of two separate entities into a single, cohesive unit. I felt my guard drop, the walls I had built around my heart crumbling not from force, but from neglect, because I no longer needed them to keep her out. The internal audit was finally closed. Every variable was accounted for. Every doubt was reconciled. We didn't move to the bedroom. We stayed right there, on the couch, entangled in the dim light, the silence of the apartment finally feeling full instead of empty. The wall behind us was no longer a barrier or a conductor. It was just a structural necessity, irrelevant to the reality of us occupying the same space. We fell asleep like that, limbs heavy with exhaustion and relief, breathing in the same rhythm, the thin wall standing silent witness to the fact that it was no longer needed to transmit our feelings. When the morning light filtered through the blinds, painting stripes across the floorboards, it illuminated a new reality. I woke up to the weight of an arm draped over my waist, the steady, grounding presence of Emery breathing against my neck. I lay there for a moment, just listening. I didn't hear the coffee grinder next door. I didn't hear the shower running in 3B. I heard the quiet hum of the city waking up, but this time the sound wasn't filtered through layers of drywall. It was right here, immediate and shared. We were on the same side of the wall, and the ledger was finally perfectly balanced. The silence of the apartment was no longer a solitary asset to be guarded. It was a shared equity, rich with the promise of coffee brewed for two. The thin walls that had once threatened my privacy were now just a reminder of the proximity we had chosen, a testament to the fact that some barriers are meant to be breached. If you've ever found love in the most unexpected proximity, subscribe to Follow the Journey.